Number 1.
I grew up in Indiana, and when I was 17, I got my first car and started exploring. I lived somewhere pretty suburban, but if you drive an hour south, you're in the middle of nowhere. Tons of cornfields and abandoned houses. My friend and I started driving out there a lot, and started going to those abandoned houses and exploring them. My dad bought a camera for the family a bit earlier, so I would take that and shoot some photos of the houses. We got really good at finding them too. We looked out for the normal signs, broken mailboxes, long grass, heavy wear on the houses, etc. But sometimes, we were still worried about whether or not some of the places we went to were completely abandoned. The best houses don't look as obvious from the outside. Like, if a house looks like it's in decent condition, it's most likely to have some stuff inside it. If it's super obvious, like broken windows, missing doors, etc., kids probably already found it and spray painted it and broke stuff inside. We were really respectful about it and wanted to explore places other people didn't, so we looked for more subtle places. I remember my friend and I were coming back from a concert in Indianapolis in the summer. We spent the night at my cousin's place in the city, since the drive back is really long. We left during the day and started taking alternate routes back to try and find any cool places to explore. We were driving down this long dirt road, one of those that doesn't even have a name and is called something like Country Road 3282 or whatever it was. After a while, we see a long dirt driveway coming out to the left, and in the distance we see this really broken house. We pulled into the driveway and drove down. It was probably a quarter-mile long. There was a huge no trespassing sign, which usually means the place is definitely abandoned. I know that sounds stupid, but it was something that made us way more confident in the house. We park and walk up to it. The door was falling off and the windows were cracked. Inside the house, everything was thrown around. It had that normal, musty, abandoned house smell, but something just made it smell a lot stronger than usual, like more rotten kind of. I don't know how to describe it, it was just really weird. I figured since most of the stuff in the house was thrown around and mouldy and rotten, it was probably just that. There was this tiny room to the side, but it was completely dark, so we walked past it. We walk towards the stairs and start stepping over broken glass, like a lot of it. It's common to see broken glass on the ground, but a huge area was completely covered in it. It made loud cracks as we walked on them. I started feeling worried. We walked up to the stairs, which was also covered in the glass. At the top, there was a long hallway. 2 rooms were opened on the side, and at the end was a closed door. The 2 rooms were mostly empty. I saw a bunch of garbage in one room, black hoses, mason jars, Coke bottles with tubing. We kept walking and went up to the door and opened it. Suddenly, the smell hit us hard. It was this super strong chemical rotting odor. And then we spot him. There was a guy in the room. He was really frail, super gaunt. He was wearing really baggy clothes and had sores all over his face. He was holding a rifle and staring right at us. I couldn't speak. I see some beakers, some bottles and tubing on this table that looks like a really crappy science fair project. He lifts the gun up to point at us and we sprint out. We got out of the house, started the car and drove off. We called the police and it turns out he and a friend were squatting the place and running a meth lab. The police found the one guy upstairs and the other guy was in that really dark room downstairs. He heard our car come and was hiding in there and watching us the entire time. I have no clue why he didn't try to stop us. He was probably just tweaking out really hard. The broken glass was there to make noise to alert them when someone else was inside. I feel so lucky to be alive and safe because they could have easily killed us and no one would have known we were there, and they would have probably never been caught. I haven't explored any abandoned houses since that.
Number 2.
to preface this, I want to say that last year I spent about 32 days in the woods, either scouting, hunting, or fishing. The year before that, I spent about 22 days. This doesn't include my regular hunts and camping adventures, which in the past 3 years adds up to just over 100 days. I've been hunting since I was 9, and I've spent a lot of time outdoors, in various different parts of the US and in Canada. I've seen and heard a lot of strange stuff, but this takes the cake. I was in Cohutta, North Georgia wilderness for 7 days scouting for bears, wild hogs, and deer, prepping for a hunting trip later that year. I had hiked in about 10 miles and then went off trail for another 3 to 5 miles. Basically, I was out in the middle of nowhere. Since I was alone, I was using a hammock that was built in a bug net, and I had a rain fly over it. I spent about 3 days halfway up a mountain, just looking for a good place to hunt. I saw 3 to 4 good-sized bears, about 10 hogs, and came across some good-sized deer. On the 4th day, I was going to head down to a small stream that I had marked on my GPS, and then set up camp and restock on water and prep for the 2-day hike back. I could have gone faster, but wanted to be able to look for any animal sign along the way. As I was approaching this small stream, I noticed a tent, which I was excited to see, as I had been completely alone for a few days and it's always nice to run into another hiker. Generally, us wilderness folks are pretty down to earth. As I got closer to the tent, I noticed that there was a small pack on the ground just outside of it. I figured the person couldn't have been too far from where the camp was, so I set up my camp about 30 yards away, and with about 4 hours of daylight left, started cooking some dinner. 2 hours later, I was starting to wonder where this person was. Given that I was in the wilderness, and it was over a day hike out, there wasn't much I could do, but I did hike around the site, making a circle as I went out, to look for any signs of struggle in case of a bear attack, or maybe they had an injury. I got about a quarter of a mile from the campsite, started walking in a circle, but didn't find anything. As night came, no one showed up. I started a fire in hopes that the person would be able to find where they set up and have some light. Fires burn really bright and are very easy to see from far away. After eating, searching, and hoping that the person was going to make it back, I called it a night. I had a small flask with me and took a couple sips of whiskey, jumped into my hammock with my pistol, and attempted to go to sleep. I sleep pretty hard, really hard, regardless of where I am. It really annoys my friends because I can always seem to fall asleep and stay asleep, regardless of where in the world we are. But this night was different. I felt like something was just off. Something wasn't right. But I figured it was just me worrying about this person who, by all my accounts, was completely missing. So, for the first time in my life, I woke up to the sound of what I thought was footsteps. But not in the sense of footsteps on leaves, but what a heavy-footed person would make walking on an old wood floor. It was extremely loud. I got my gun, grabbed my headlight stored in a small compartment above me, and waited to see if it would stop. Right at that moment, it stopped. Then I saw something that scared the shit out of me. On my rainfly, the gleam of a flashlight, faint but there. I shouted, "Hello?" And right when I did, it sounded like 10 people suddenly running away from me in every direction. I dropped out of my hammock onto the ground, frantically turning on my headlamp, shining it all around me, but didn't see anything. My heart was racing pretty bad, but I thought it might have just been the reflection of the moon on the rainfly. Yeah, that was it. And those footsteps running away from me was probably armadillos or something. Even though their eyes shine, they are pretty easy to spot. Problem was, there was no moon that night. I'd never seen an armadillo above 2,000 feet, and for some reason, the campsite I set up by was gone. The fire had been put out by water. It was apparent because there was not a damn coal in that thing. I thought for sure it was about 4 AM, but I had only been asleep for about an hour. At this point, I wanted to leave, but hiking out in the wilderness while it's dark is always a bad idea. So I grabbed my flask, took a swig of whiskey, removed my rain fly so I could see out of my hammock and around the area I was in, and tried my hardest to go back to sleep. I was laying down when I saw some light hit the trees above me. It was clear it was coming from downstream, and I got out of my hammock and started yelling, "Hey, y'all need any help?" No response. I saw whatever was putting out the light, and it spun around and started heading downstream really fast. At this point, my body had pumped through more adrenaline than it had blood. I was exhausted from it all. I finally was able to fall asleep and woke up around 7 a.m. When I did, I noticed my water filter I had left out was missing. It's a gravity filter, and it hangs on a tree, filtering water down into my rain bladder that I put in my backpack. And my water bladder, sitting in the base of a tree, looks like it was cut down the middle with a knife. They cut down my bear bag, which had food in it, and took some of it. The creepiest part of all was that they went through my bag, which was under my hammock while I was sleeping. I checked the bear bag before I went back to sleep the second time, and it was still there, hanging, and my bag under my hammock hadn't been touched. I packed all my stuff and hightailed it out of there, keeping my pistol close to me and moving as fast as I could. I ended up making the hike back up in just under 15 hours. I hiked the trail part in the night because I wasn't about to spend another night out there. I didn't see anyone on my hike out, and there were no cars parked at the trail ahead. The DNR said they had only seen my car there. Since then, I haven't gone back there without any friends. I reported all of this to the local DNR, but they looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I am.
Number 3.
This is by no means the only creepy thing that has ever happened to me, and the more I thought about it today, the more I realized I've had over my fair share of scary encounters. But the story you're about to hear is by far and away the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. When I was in my early 20s, I had a friend with a psychotic alcoholic father. She didn't live with him, he lived in a remote little coastal town. Now and again we would go together to visit him and stay the night. My relationship with him was creepy in itself, but that isn't the subject now. One night, we were visiting, my friend and her dad had a drunken blow-up, and he kicked us out of the house. It was about midnight. We had gotten a lift down and didn't have a car. My friend's dad lived about 4 kilometers out of town, and I say town, but really it was just a huddle of 2 or 3 shops, by way of a dirt road. We had no other choice but to start walking down the dirt road to the town, where there was a telephone booth. This was in the days before it was commonplace to have a mobile phone. I was going to call my folks, who lived about an hour and a half away, and see if they would come to get us. The whole way to the town, my friend was drunkenly moaning and crying about her broken relationship with her father, and she hadn't let up by the time we got to the phone booth. She sat on a bench next to the phone while I woke my parents up. They agreed to come and get us, and I sat down on the bench for the long wait. Shortly after this, a van appeared and parked just behind the bench where we were sitting on, maybe 5 to 10 meters away. There were 2 young men in the front seats, and they were looking at us. If that didn't make me nervous enough, the van door slid open, and I saw there were a number of young guys in the back, around the same age as the ones in the front. I don't remember how many, definitely more than 2. The place we were sitting was deserted. There were no houses nearby, just more road. No people, nowhere to run, no one driving by. It was just a shitty little nowhere town. I stood up so I could see them better and kept my eyes fixed on the van full of men, acutely aware of our vulnerability. What I saw was that they were looking back at us. They were talking amongst themselves, quietly at first. Then they started talking more and more loudly. It became evident they were deliberately talking loudly enough for us to hear. They were talking about pulling us into the van and taking us somewhere to rape and kill us. I can't remember the exact words, but that was the gist of it. My whole body was not shaking, it was quaking with terror. I couldn't take my eyes off the men though. I remember the face of one of them so clearly I could draw it right now. He was just sitting in the door of the van, looking at me with no expression, looking at me with dead eyes, looking at me like I was a thing. All this time, my drunk friend hadn't stopped sobbing to herself. Whether she knew the van was there at all, I couldn't say. I knew I had to tell her about the danger, but I was actually so full of terror I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. That was when the most incredible thing happened. Out of nowhere, my friend's father, who has never apologized to anyone in his life, and who is the most awkward prick alive, appeared, drunk, in his car. It's hard to describe how unlikely it was for him to do this. He could hold a grudge like no one you've ever met. He was just an all-round stubborn bastard. He and my friend had an emotional reunion. The whole time, my eyes were fixated on the guys and the van. The men had stopped talking at this point and were just watching us. "Let's go," I said. We got back in the car and started heading for my friend's dad's house. The van full of men started up and began to follow us. I tried to explain to my friend's dad about the men, but he said, "I'll just slow down and they can pass." Then they slowed to a crawl behind us. Then they began to shout out of the windows, screaming threats. They followed us all the way down the dirt road, and then all the way down the driveway of my friend's dad's house. And they just sat in the van behind us, and we sat in the car waiting to see what would happen. All of my friend's dad's neighbors were holiday homes, and nobody was in that night. We knew if the group of men decided to get out of the van and carry out their threats, we would get no help. After a very long time, the van backed out of the driveway, and just like that, they left. My friend's dad hid in shame, and I went back to my family's house. I've been asked if I went to the police, but honestly I can't remember. I don't think I did. It was just a completely messed up time in my life. But that incident's changed me forever. I'm a very cautious person now. I'm very protective of my kids. And I don't want to change that, because I'd rather be like this than accidentally trust one of the millions of psychos out there.
Number 4.
When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labour to rural areas of Australia. Basically, what you did was tell them when you were available, and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks where you do whatever they needed done. It was hard work and long hours, but good pay and good fun if you got in with a nice group of workers. When this occurred, I was working on a large property, roughly the same landmass as the state of Maryland in the USA, about 9 hours from Sydney City, and the property itself was about 40 minutes from the nearest town. In short, it was the middle of nowhere. I was working on the farm clearing bushland with 3 other guys my age from the city. Our boss was a guy called Jeremy who owned the farm and supervised us while helping out with the work. He was pretty laid back and was generally really good to us. This summer in particular was very hot and the work was hard. So one day the temperature hit 38 degrees Celsius, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, when Jeremy decided to give us the afternoon off. He said he knew of a really nice pond about a 25-minute drive north. I was keen for a swim, but the other guys just wanted to relax for the afternoon. So him and I hopped in one of the work trucks and started heading across the property. It was mostly wide, empty expanses with a few clumps of scattered bushland. Jeremy wasn't much of a talker, so we drove more or less in silence. After about 20 minutes, however, he suddenly perked up and jabbed me in the ribs. "Do you see that over there, beneath the 2 dead trees?" Now, I should mention here that if you're not familiar with inland areas, particularly those in Australia, they are brown or red and mostly flat and bland, meaning any bright colours stick out like a sore thumb, so you can imagine our surprise when we could see a large blue angular structure far off in the distance. We steered in its direction, and as we got closer, we realized it was a huge blue shipping container just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Jeremy was perplexed. I asked him if he knew what it was, but he obviously didn't. He said he hadn't seen it when he drove through the same area about 5 weeks before, and he wanted to go and see what it was. Initially, we pulled to a stop about 100 meters away from it. At this stage, I had a really bad feeling. The whole thing just wasn't right. It's hard to explain, but if you can imagine seeing such a foreign object in the middle of a huge barren expanse, it had to be something strange. Jeremy, however, wanted to investigate, which I understood, given it was his property, but in truth, I was really anxious. As we got closer, things got even more bizarre. There was a big diesel generator behind it thumping away, and a CCTV camera on each side, all motion activated so they buzzed around from side to side, following us as we moved around. I tried to reason with Jeremy, something along the lines of, "With all the security, someone obviously doesn't want us here. Let's just go." He brushed me off, however, reminding me that it was his farm, and whoever had put this here was trespassing, so he wanted to go inside. Despite all the surveillance, there was only a small padlock on the huge door. We had some bolt cutters in his toolbox, and after a bit of a struggle, we broke the lock and went inside. The first thing I noticed was the rush of cold air as we got in. The place was air conditioned, which I must admit was quite pleasant on such a hot day. We searched around for a light switch, but I could already see this was some sort of a IT setup. There were flashing LEDs all around the place and the sort of hum you hear when a hard drive is working hard. When we finally switched on the lights, we could see a sophisticated, albeit somewhat cluttered office setup. There were hard drives the size of bar fridges and other computer equipment lining the walls, sometimes piled 2 or 3 high, and plastic storage boxes scattered around the far wall, and several desks with computer monitors arranged in the middle, complete with rolling office chairs. At this stage, I felt like I was in one of those nonsensical dreams. This made absolutely no sense. We wandered to the middle and sat down at the desks to see if the computers could give us any idea of what the hell was going on out here. My heart was racing and I just wanted to leave. We had been seen by the CCTV, so if anyone was monitoring, they already knew we were here. Jeremy, on the other side, was adamant we had to get to the bottom of this, so I put on a brave face and started looking through the computer. This went on for a while, but in short, neither of us had a very high grasp of tech, outside of Facebook and Microsoft Word. The best I can describe it from my lay position is that it was an endless list of computer talk. It was like what the old Napster or LimeWire download screens looked like, just constantly picking up and receiving data, then recording it on several windows. I gave up on the computers and walked cautiously over the far end of the container to the big pile of storage boxes. By then, I was pretty sure no one else was there, as there was nowhere to hide really, but I was still incredibly on edge. I decided, against my better judgment, to see what was inside all these boxes. My brief sift through these boxes makes me feel sick to my stomach to this day. It didn't take long for me to realize that this box was full of posters, DVDs and photos, all of hardcore child pornography. One thing that still gets to me is that it was all neatly ordered into folders in small boxes. These people were organized. I immediately recoiled, jumped up and ran over to Jeremy. I could hardly string a sentence together. I said something to the effect of, "Mate, get out, child sex, go, just get out." I dragged him out, composed myself, and managed to explain what I saw. We jumped back into the truck and sped back to the house. The farm had no mobile reception, and we hadn't bought the satellite phone, so we had to get back to the landline to call the police. Once we called them, they still had to make it all the way to the farm from the nearest police station, which was in a town about a half hour from the town closest to the farm. We waited, talking frantically about what we'd seen, until the cops arrived almost an hour later. They arrived with 2 4-wheel drives, and we jumped in and led them back. This is where it gets worse. By the time we got back, the container door was open, and there was fire inside. We only had 2 small extinguishers in the cars, and these did very little. The fire department took an hour to get there, by which stage most of the damage was already done. An arson report by the federal police found almost no evidence of the computer equipment described, and only traces of paper and cardboard. This meant whoever ran this knew we were there and had time to come and remove most of it and get away. There were various ways to get off the property, and the landmass was huge, so there was no real way to tail them. Since the police hadn't taken us all too seriously in the first instance, probably due to our poor explanation on the phone, aerial surveillance was almost impossible by the time we had pieced it all together. I took a keen interest in following it up, but with no real evidence of who might be responsible, the investigation went cold. I've kept in contact with Jeremy, and the shipping container is still there to this day on the farm, as it's too expensive to move. I'll never forget what I saw in those boxes.
Hey guys, it's the Grim Reader here. I hope you enjoyed listening through that. If you did, please slap a like, and if you haven't already, why not subscribe to be notified of future uploads? If you have a story you want me to narrate, please send it to my email in the description box. Once again, thanks a lot for listening.